Hello, everybody. This is Neve, and I'm coming back to you with Chains and Eyeless Jack X Listener. We're going to start off with chapter 14, and starting with the reader's POV. Birdsong filled the air as I stepped outside, a warm breeze ruffling my hair. Sunlight filtered through the thick canopies of leaves above us, and a smile flashed across my lips as I inhaled the air, savoring the various scents of the woods around me. It had been more than a week since I'd last been outside, and the fresh air felt and tasted amazing. Come on, Jack said, snapping me out of my reverie. I nodded as I quickly followed him. After changing out of our night clothes, Jack had grabbed a backpack and led me outside. I paused as we passed Buddy's pickup truck, casting it an uncertain glance as it raised old memories. But I turned my attention away and continued following Jack. I didn't know why he was taking me outside, but right now I wasn't complaining. I highly doubted he was taking me somewhere to kill me. It was the middle of the day after all, and his cabin was already isolated enough. Neither of us spoke as we walked the woods, following a faint dirt trail to places unknown, but that was okay. I glanced around in wonder. Growing up alone in the mountains, I'd always felt a strong connection to nature, so I felt perfectly content here. Fresh green leaves littered the trail, bending as we stepped on them, but being too soft to break. Shadows covered most of the ground due to the thick canopies of the trees towering above us, but the sun managed to penetrate it anyway and cast plenty of light. I heard animals scurrying among the trees, and I smiled as I saw a squirrel jump from one tree to another, almost gliding through the air before landing and continuing on its way nonchalantly. After about 15 minutes of walking, we reached a small clearing. Several dummies hung from the trees, covered in cuts and slashes, with stuffing dripping to the ground. I shuddered slightly as I realized that most of the cuts were around the locations of organs. Obviously, this is where Jack practiced. He gestured for me to sit on a tree stump as he set his bag on the ground, and I used my sleeve to brush off any bugs before doing so. Are you good at sewing? He asked as he sorted through the bag, and I shrugged. I'm so. I hadn't sewn that often. Good enough. He tossed me a small plastic red box, and I opened it to see it was full of several pre-threaded needles and swatches of fabric. As I removed one of the needles to examine it, Jack cut down one of the dummies from the tree, grunting as he carried it over to me. Patches covered its surface where the cuts were, and he quickly tore them off, setting it on my lap, he told me. Sew new patches on it. So he brought me outside just to do chores? Oh well, at least I was outside that musty room. I nodded as I removed a swatch of blue fabric and laid it over one of the holes, carefully piercing the harsh material of the dummy with the needle. Meanwhile, Jack removed another dummy and set to work with his own sewing kit. We worked in silence for a while, only the symphony of nature filling the void. After about 3 patches, my fingers were getting sore from holding the tiny needle, so I decided to take a small break. A glance at Jack's dummy revealed he'd managed to patch only 2 more holes than I had, and much more shabbily. Weird, I thought. I'd expected him to be better since he probably had more experience. Then I realized he was sewing with the bandage hand. I frowned as I watched him. I assumed he'd hurt it when he punched the wall or whatever. Why had he done that? It wasn't just because he had had a bad night. That horrible wailing afterwards indicated something more. Again, my earlier suspicion came to mind, but the theory still felt pretty outrageous, and yet. Jack's POV. Sewing new patches onto the dummy was taking a bit longer than it should, thanks to this bruised hand. Bending his hand to grip the tiny needle created a dull pain, and he gritted his teeth as he tried to ignore it. He should have been done with twice as much by now. This was just getting more frustrating by the second. He uttered a small curse as he pricked his fingers, sucking in a sharp breath. It was at that point he noticed that Ash was staring at him. Frowning, he tilted his head and mumbled, "What?" "Nothing," she quickly replied. Pausing, she added, "Want to take a break?" Jack didn't respond, but instead just sighed and shrugged. It wasn't like he was getting much done anyway. He could use the time to cool off. He pushed the dummy off his lap and opened the backpack, removing a water bottle and tossing it to her. As she unscrewed the cap and took a grateful sip, he watched silently, just thinking. Jack wasn't sure why he'd brought Ash along. It wasn't like he needed her help. Sure, he was having trouble, but he would have gotten it done eventually. He could have easily left her alone, but today he didn't feel like it. Last night he'd forgotten to take off her shackle, and he didn't want to make her wear it any more than necessary. Nor did he feel like locking her in a room. Except those shouldn't matter. Sure, he cared about her physical well-being, but she was just a pet to him, a plaything to toy with mentally. Maybe he just didn't want to be alone. After going to bed, he'd been plagued all night by dreams of his captivity. Whenever he drifted off, he dreamed he was back in that basement, completely immobile while that man's demonic cackling filled his ears. Panic and desperation filled him each time, emotions which were alien to the inhuman being. Yes, he created them in his victims, but he himself hadn't experienced those feelings in years. No matter what he did, he never seemed to be able to wake up, and when he did, he'd just cry softly before falling asleep again. Hearing the chains rattle when Ash knocked on his door that morning hadn't helped, making him think for a brief, terrifying moment that Buddy had returned. Speaking of the chain, Jack cast a discreet, guilty glance at Ash's ankle. Right now, he felt he was no better than his own captor. Sure, he gave her considerably more freedom than Buddy had given him, but that still wasn't much to talk about. Yesterday was the first time he'd become aware of the potential long-term effects. While he'd lost circulation in his arms from being suspended above his head for so long, he'd still had his sleeves to protect his skin from the metal. A bit of guilt filled him as he thought about it. Sighing, he reached into the bag and pulled out the remains of the lung. He hadn't been too hungry last night, so there was still a quarter of it left. Absently, he lifted his mask a little and raised it to his mouth, only to stop as he heard a small squeak. Ash was staring at him wide-eyed, her pale face. Oh, right. Humans didn't like watching people eat lungs. Jack rose and circled a large tree so he was out of her sight, leaning against the trunk as he took a large bite. Not like she tried to run away just because he couldn't see her. At this point, she feared him enough not to do something stupid like that. As he quietly finished off the lung and licked his fingers, a scent suddenly caught his nose and he tensed up, snapping his head to the side. That smell. Was it? Jack glanced around the trunk of the tree. Ash was still sitting on the stump, drinking from the bottle. Ash, he said, and the girl gave a start, drops of water falling from the bottle and onto her lap as she snapped her head to look at him. Yeah? Stay here, don't go anywhere, got it? Gulping, she nodded. Yeah, okay. Satisfied, Jack turned and followed the scent. The closer he got, the stronger it grew, and after a few minutes he came to a stop. Ducking behind a tree, he lifted his mask as he cautiously peered around the corner. A figure was sprawled on the ground, moaning softly with his leg mangled and bloody. A quick appraisal of the scene made it obvious that the man was most likely a camper and had been in that spot for quite a while, probably the result of a bad fall from the tree. Smirking, Jack lowered his mask and stepped into the clearing, deliberately stepping on a twig. The man's head snapped to the side, staring at him with wide eyes. A smile graced Jack's lips as he fingered the scalpel and hidden in his pocket, his smirk hidden by his mask. Looks like he wouldn't be going hungry after all. Chapter 15. Author's note. Warning, this chapter has gore. If you wish to skip the gore, just find paragraph 6. Which, as we see, we don't mind it. Jack's POV. Blood bubbled along the cut Jack made with the scalpel, taking his sweet time as he listened to the man scream in painful agony. It had been so long since he'd last been able to truly savor the terror of one watching their final moments, knowing their death were upon them and that they were helpless to stop it. Usually his victims were asleep, and lately he had been slitting their throats before starting because he was still so weak from captivity. This man, though, was the perfect victim. He was already injured, and Jack had mangled his limbs further, first crushing his hands and feet with large stones and then slicing his tendons. Right now this was exactly what he needed, and Jack would take his sweet time, drawing it out as long as possible. Everything about this was so perfect. Removing a blood-specked glove, the man's brown eyes widened even further as he saw Jack's ash-gray skin and black claw-like nails, uttering a single sob at the sight. Such a glorious sound, almost as beautiful as the screams. Reaching inside the cut, Jack felt around the man's innards until he felt the familiar slimy texture of a kidney, grinning as he wrapped his fingers around it and ripped it out of the body. The man gasped in pain and screeched, but his pain soon turned to disgust as Jack lifted his mask and raised it to his mouth, puncturing it with his shark-like teeth. Blood spurted as he tore off a chunk and began chewing, strings of flesh dropping into the man's face. Vomit rose up in the man's throat, and he turned his head as he puked, bile dripping down his cheek. Gross, Jack grumbled, but smirked as he said it. Devouring the kidney as graphically as possible, he licked his fingers before reaching inside for more. One by one, he removed the man's innards, starting with the least vital organs and working his way up. Some he devoured right there, others he just stuffed into the pocket of his hoodie, audibly sloshing around and squishing against each other with each movement he made as he continued the gory, drawn-out torture. Tucking the intestines with a single finger, he lifted it until they grew too taut and snapped. making the man screech before Jack snapped another point to create a long, severed section. He lifted it to his mouth and slurped it like a noodle, ignoring the man's gagging and further sounds of vomiting as he chewed and swallowed. Every time the man seemed ready to pass out, Jack would slap his face to keep him awake. He couldn't pass out now if he were uncautious. Jack couldn't savor his fear and horror. Gradually, the man's chest became a gory, empty husk, its contents vanishing either into Jack's stomach or his pockets. Eventually, Jack's fingers wrapped around the man's beating heart. He leaned over as he carefully lifted it without severing it, the man's body twitching at the motion. Jack cast a final glance at the man's face. Tears, blood, and snot trailed down his chin, his breaths nothing more than blubbering sobs. Flesh and blood decorated Jack's razor-sharp teeth as he grinned at this man, absolute horror. And they chomped onto the man's heart, and his body went still. By the time he finished, Jack was filthy with blood, but overall satisfied. This more than made up for last night's failure, and he had enough food to last him a while. Humming cheerfully to himself, Jack didn't bother picking up his gloves as he began to walk into the clearing, the organs in his pockets sloshing with each bouncing step. He'd have to return later to collect the remainder of the man's organs, but first he had to take Ash home. He chuckled as he imagined her expression when she'd see him covered in blood. No doubt she'd heard the screaming. She'd be so terrified she might even cry. "Oh, Ash," he called in a sing-song voice, grinning under his mask. "I'm back." Jack's voice trailed off as the clearing came into sight, blinking and looking around. The sewing kit and dummies were on the ground, but Ash was nowhere to be seen. Surprised, Jack didn't react right away, just standing in shock. Anger started to rumble inside of him, quickly expanding until it exploded in a pure fury and rage. Jack growled as he slammed his good fist against a tree, his concealed face contorting with rage. "Ash!" Reader's POV. Blood-curdling screams rang through the air, making me wince and nearly prick myself with a needle. Jack was obviously busy with the victim, but I didn't dare run away. I did not want to get on his bad side, and in an attempt to ignore the screams, I focused all of my attention on sewing patches onto the dummy. Tying off the final stitch, I gave a sigh and winced as I heard another scream. Shuddering, I opened the box to get another piece of fabric, but of course at that moment a gust of wind came by and the one on top blew away. I quickly closed the box before the rest blew away and pushed the dummy to the ground so I could chase after the airborne fabric. The wind seemed to be toying with me, always carrying it just out of my reach. I grunted as I squeezed through some bushes, knowing full well I looked like an idiot jumping around and chasing it, but I really didn't care. Reaching for it, I gave a final jump and sprung into the air, managing to finally snag the cloth between my fingers. "Finally!" I gasped as I landed, smirking at the cloth. "Too bad, wind, you lose." Was this normal, or was this just a result of going stir-crazy? As I stood there pondering my taunts to the wind, I was suddenly startled back into reality by an angry voice. "Ash." I went slowly turning around. Twigs snapped violently as footsteps thundered towards my direction. Before I knew it, Jack suddenly appeared and lunged at me, pinning me against the nearest tree. I gave a gasp as the air left my lungs from the force of the impact, pain shooting through my spine. Even as I reeled from the pain, though, I couldn't help noticing that his navy blue mask had several specks of red. Shiny red splotches stained his clothing, making me gag at the sight. Blood, he was covered in blood. "What are you doing?" he growled, and I could easily imagine him baring his teeth under his mask, strings of flesh hanging from the pointed tips. Fear coursed through my veins, my eyes widening as tears threatened to fall. At this point, the only reason my knees hadn't given out was because Jack was holding me up by my neck, his blood-splattered hands wrapping around it and squeezing painfully. I gasped for air, but his iron grip didn't release. "I told you not to go anywhere. Were you trying to run away?" "No," I whispered, shaking my head slightly, but his grip just tightened. "Then why did you leave? What are you doing here, Ash? Answer me." I tried to speak to tell him I was just chasing out the fabric after the wind carried away, but I couldn't. His grip on my neck was too tight, cutting off my air supply. Fury radiated from his very being, and I realized that even if I could speak, he probably wouldn't believe me. He was just too angry. My vision blurred as oxygen left my lungs, but Jack didn't release his grip. Instead, he only seemed to grow tighter, his growls and yelling louder, his words becoming a blur and an unidentifiable, angry noise, and my vision was starting to turn black. At that moment, my consciousness threatening to fade, something in me finally snapped. Instinct kicked in, and my body began moving on its own. His claws grazed my neck as I thrust my head forward, and I could feel blood trickling down, but I didn't care. My head connected with his forehead, and he let out a cry of surprise as his hands loosened their grip. Gasping in large gulps of sweet, wonderful air, I quickly brought up my knee as hard as I could, hitting him square in the nuts. Monster or not, he still had basic human anatomy, meaning he shared the same weakness as all males. He gave a gasp and squeaked, falling to his knees while clutching the injured area. Finally free of his grip, I coughed and sputtered as I collapsed to the ground, gasping desperately for air. However, I couldn't stop yet. He wouldn't be down for long. Rolling onto my stomach, I pushed myself off the ground and began quickly crawling to a large rock resting nearby. Adrenaline surged through me, the pain in my neck and back disappearing as I lifted the rock and slowly stumbled to my feet. Funny, it felt as light as a feather. Guess that was the power of adrenaline. Lumbering towards Jack, he glanced up at me weakly just as I brought the rock down on his head. That is the end of those two chapters. It's starting to get interesting in this one. I've been waiting for her to snap finally to be like, "Hey, don't fuck with me. I'm a bad bitch." And I've just been waiting for it. Ugh. I love it. But hey, this is at 15 minutes. Lovely. Let me know how you guys felt about that chapter, and I'll be getting started on the next one, the Jeff the Killer one that you all like. Until then, I will see you into the next video. Bye bye!